Energy has always played a fundamental part in survival through nature. Ever since organisms walked the face of the earth, they have dedicated a large portion of their lives to obtain energy in the form of food. Technical advancements in agricultural development have enabled the human population to grow rapidly over the past 10,000 years. However, it was the exploitation of non-agricultural energy sources that have led to the state of the world that we currently live in. In this video, I would like to walk you through the evolution of agrarian economies, followed by a discussion on the limits that this economy faced. Additionally, the topic of the transition to a fossil fuel powered economy will be addressed, as well as an analysis that demonstrates the past and present trends in the energy system. Some focus will also be put on the established energy policies and present-day problems caused by environmental pollution as a result of the energy system. Essentially, all energy on Earth originates from the Sun, which illuminates the Earth with solar energy equivalent to that of about 128 billion tons of oil. From all this energy, a small portion is brought into the animal food chain through photosynthesis of plants. Early humans needed a large area of land to find sufficient food in order to obtain roughly 2000 kilocalories worth of energy each day. With the introduction of agriculture, the space required per person decreased substantially, allowing for a denser population. Around 12,000 years ago, roughly 4 million people were said to walk the face of the earth. 5,000 years later, this increased to 5 million people. In the 2,000 years that followed, major agricultural innovations helped the population to grow to 15 million people. These developments led to a total population estimated between 170 and 250 million people around the year zero. During this time span, fire wasn't yet used for heating. This made colder areas far away from the equator practically uninhabitable. Naturally, the realization of the application of fire for warming caused the population to further spread itself over the planet. By the 16th century, 1/8 of the Earth's surface area was under continuous cultivation. Population density, however, ranged notably from 60 people per square kilometer in Europe up to 850 in Japan. This difference was a consequence of the different kinds of agriculture that were applied. The application of animals allowed humans to harness their energy to perform heavy tasks. Later, technological advancements also allowed for the extraction of energy out of alternative sources such as water and wind. Despite these improvements in the ability to generate power, the rapid population growth around 1000 years ago put an enormous pressure on the land. Semi-fertile lands were exploited and forests were sacrificed in order to meet the high demand. This pressure was relieved with the rapid decrease of European population as a consequence of the Black Death around 1400, but returned by the 16th century. Europe was once again caught in a tension between increasing supply of energy sources and growing demand. The first partial solution originates from Holland, who managed to draw away pressure from the land whilst also creating a modern industrial economy. The population was attracted by urban centers, which generated a large labor force able to mass produce cheap products. As the Dutch increased the ability to utilize wind energy on their ships, these products could be sold over a large portion of Europe. With the developing trade, the Baltic area could supply agricultural products in return, further relieving the pressure on the Dutch farmland. To sustain the flourishing industry, peat was used as a reliable source of heating. As a non-renewable fuel source, the local peat reserves were drained rapidly and more had to be imported from further and further away. The Dutch Golden Age was driven by wind and peat, which showed that the limits to the organic energy system could be surpassed. In Britain, the solution to tension on the farmland was found through the use of mineral fuels such as coal. This transition is said to be a consequence of the wood fuel crisis in the 16th century, but could also be caused by the favorable coal price around that time, which is indicated in the following figure. The rapid increase of wood fuel prices near the year 1800 encouraged industrial users to make the transition to coal. This allowed the industry and economy to expand at a spectacular rate, which could never have possibly been sustained by means of biofuels. From the year 1500 to 1700, the coal consumption increased from 27,000 tons of oil equivalent to around 1.5 million. Again, looking at the coal price visualized in the previous figure, we see a gradual increase of price over the 17th century. This in turn was a consequence of the ever-growing demand of coal from the lacking production of the mines. A series of transformations helped to overcome this imbalance between demand and supply. An example of this would be the application of steam-powered pumps to remove water from the mines. This of course allowed for the exploitation of mines to much greater depths. Additionally, other regions started to compete with the new castle trade, allowing the coal industry to transform itself from localized business to a national economic sector. The improvements to transportation routes also played a valuable role in the reduction of the coal prices. In Britain, the energy transition was a gradual process that lasted more than 200 years. It was mainly motivated by industries looking for solutions rather than a lack of fertile land. The improvements in agricultural productivity drove a large portion of the labor force to the urban areas. To keep warm, coal was the main energy source as few had access to, for instance, wood. By the year 1800, 3/4 of the energy requirements of a British economy came from heating services in households, buildings and industry. Around this time, wind and water power only supplied 10% of the total power demand. It was only by the 19th century that the steam engine found its application in ships, trains and the cotton industry. Around 1900, roughly 2/3 of all power services were driven by steam engines. Further technological improvements and a growing workforce managed to fulfill the still continuously increasing demand of coal. It was around this period that many other countries discovered their large coal reserves and followed Britain's lead, making coal the source to induce the transition from organic to fossil fuel in the industrial economy. For instance, the coal contribution to the energy generation of the United States increased from less than 10% to 90% between 1850 and 1910. This clearly indicates the potential speed at which transition can take place when the required technologies are already available. Up until the second half of the 20th century, coal met the energy requirements of many countries. Although global production continued to grow, the fragmentation of supply also reflected its jeopardy as a dominant energy source. With the introduction of alternative energy sources, the next phase in energy history was born. Whilst they initially emerged from the lighting market, the success of gas, petroleum and electricity, along with their rapid decrease in price, encouraged them to be used in other originally coal-powered energy industries. Oil was first extracted on a large scale from the oil fields in the 1860s in Pennsylvania, the northeast of the United States. The introduction and application of the internal combustion engine early in the 20th century caused petroleum products to be used to greater extent in the transportation sector. It was only between the First and Second World War that the demand for gasoline grew substantially as a consequence of low car prices. Then, as a result of the American antitrust laws and increase of suppliers, the petroleum price gradually dropped between 1930 and 1970. Especially after the Second World War, the global production and consumption of oil skyrocketed. Reason for this was the increasing demand of private transport and the application of oil for heating and electricity generation. By the early 1970s, the American oil consumption exceeded its supply for the first time in history. This was remarkable because the US was the largest oil producer in the world. Because of this, the American companies no longer had the ability to control the oil prices. This privilege was now in the hands of the Saudi Arabian oil industry, which limited its supply and raised its prices as a response to the American and European policies maintained in the Middle East. This happenstance of events led to the first ever global oil crisis in 1973 and was followed by other concerns about the Eastern oil supply dependency. The reason for oil prices dropping back in the 1990s was the result of many countries increasing or initiating their own oil production, something that can clearly be derived from the following figure. In the beginning of the 21st century, the oil prices rose slightly as a consequence of the substantially increased consumption and political instability in the Middle East, but they dropped again by the end of the first decade as the global economy entered a recession. The concerns about energy security, that is, the dependency on other countries for oil supplies, caused three important reactions among importing governments. Some strived to find oil within their own borders, or forged strong political bonds with exporting countries, while others started to invest in alternative sources of energy. One of these sources was gas, a fuel initially retrieved from coal production with the application of street lighting of industrializing nations in the middle of the 19th century. Natural gas, which is gas often found during the extraction of oil, also saw a growing demand after the oil crisis. By the year 2000, 21% of the global energy market was provided by means of natural gas, something indicated by the following graph. During this time, more and more electricity found its application in urban transport services and industrial power needs. This electrification of the global economy had radically altered the aspects of productive activities. Electricity could extend and replace physical human effort, but could also provide these services easier and in a more flexible environment. You see, early machinery was driven by one central steam engine coupled with shafts and belts, inducing several impracticalities and safety hazards. The introduction of electricity allowed for the elimination of many of these drawbacks. Initially, most electricity was generated through the combustion of coal and oil. Countries later explored the paths of power generation through nuclear and hydropower, which together were responsible for 12% of the global electricity generation around the year 2000. To not get lost in annual totals, I would like to take a brief moment to discuss the energy intensity and use per capita. The historical personal energy consumption grew rapidly between 1850 and 1979, after which it barely changed at all. The energy intensity, however, follows a more complex path, probably due to the value placed on products in the early phases of industrialization. Although much energy was used in this period, it generated important increases in the gross domestic product. Between 1850 and 1913, the heat-intensive activities for heavy industries drove up the energy intensity. This energy intensity has been falling ever since. Now, let's take some time to focus on the evolution of energy policies. Historically, the government had other priorities than to focus on modern energy generation, and had little influence on the economy. Though in many cases, governments have introduced economic policies such as new institutions or taxation schemes. These decisions were rarely concerned with the impact on the energy economy and were often revoked when they resulted in abrupt changes in the market. And apart from a few exceptions, bans on deforesting rarely occurred. With the transition to fossil fuels, the involvement of the state gradually increased. The first half of the 20th century highlighted some potential drawbacks of unregulated competition in the form of supply shortages and poorly integrated systems. When the dependency on fuel became apparent in the Second World War, many countries decided to nationalize their oil and electricity companies. The dismantling of the monopolistic structure of energy production and supply started in the 1980s and is something that's still being worked towards till this day. With regards to emissions, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, might be the first organization to make efforts to minimize the impact of greenhouse gases. The first agreement on target emissions would be the Kyoto Protocol, which was composed in 1997. This protocol was a modest step towards international cooperation and regulation of environment-related energy behavior. Of course, problems related to carbon emissions have been around for ages. In Britain, for instance, it is estimated that health damage related to smoke valued a quarter of Britain's gross domestic product near the end of the 19th century. The environmental impact of greenhouse gases has shown to be rather alarming over the past decades. The carbon emissions have increased, whilst nature's ability to absorb them has degraded due to deforestation during the agricultural revolution. Since Europe was the first continent to industrialize, and since their driving fuel was coal, Europe has been the largest polluter in history. North America surpassed Europe in annual emissions in the year 1999. But since 1994, the largest emitter of carbon emissions has been the Asian Pacific region, responsible for 2.7 billion tons in the year 2004. Renewable energy sources met an estimated 95% of all global energy needs in the beginning of the 19th century. At the beginning of the 20th century, it fell to about 38% and down to 16% at the dawn of the 21st century. While the amount of annual solar radiation on Earth is about 12.8 thousand times greater than the world energy consumption in the year 2000, without an abrupt transformation of the global energy system, this trend is likely to continue. Although many investments are made in renewable energy sources, this has yet to induce a reduction of the use of fossil fuel. Hopefully, this video has helped you gain some insights in the development of the energy economy up until the 20th century. Thanks for your concern on this subject, and thanks for watching till the end.